Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In August of 1976, a truck driver made a grim discovery along a lonely stretch of South Carolina highway. The bodies of two young people, shot multiple times and stripped of all identification. For 45 years they were known simply as the Sumter County Does, their true names and stories lost to time. That is, until modern DNA technology finally gave these victims back their identities. Tonight we'll explore how a free-spirited young man from Pennsylvania and an adventurous Minnesota teenager crossed paths, and how their journey ended in tragedy on that dark summer night. Let's begin. On a humid August morning in 1976, a trucker driving along a lonely stretch of South Carolina's Highway 521 made a discovery that would puzzle investigators for nearly half a century. There, on the side of the road in Sumter County, lay the bodies of two young people, a man and a woman, both victims of multiple gunshot wounds. They carried no identification, no wallets, nothing to tell authorities who they were or where they came from. They would become known simply as the Sumter County Does. The victims were found near Lynchburg, South Carolina, a small town with barely more than 400 residents at the time. The young woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, with shoulder-length, reddish-brown hair and striking features. She wore a pink halter top, blue jeans, and uniquely designed Indian-style jewelry. The young man, estimated to be in his mid-20s, had brown hair and wore a red t-shirt and blue jeans. Both victims were well dressed and appeared clean and healthy, suggesting they weren't transients or homeless individuals. The initial investigation revealed that both victims had been shot multiple times with a .357 caliber revolver. The male victim had been shot 3 times, while the female victim sustained 5 gunshot wounds. The shooting appeared to have occurred where the bodies were found, and evidence suggested they had been killed just hours before their discovery. But beyond these basic facts, investigators had precious little to go on. What made the case particularly puzzling was the complete absence of identification. In 1976, it was unusual for young people traveling to carry absolutely no form of ID. No credit cards, no driver's licenses, no social security cards, nothing that could provide even the smallest clue to their identities. Their clothing tags had been removed, and there were no identifying marks or labels that could help trace their origins. The investigation that followed was extensive. Law enforcement officials took fingerprints, dental charts, and photographs. They created detailed descriptions of the victims and their clothing. The young woman's distinctive jewelry, silver and turquoise pieces in a Native American style, seemed like it might provide a lead, but inquiries to jewelry makers and vendors across the country led nowhere. Local newspapers ran stories about the mysterious couple, and their photographs were distributed widely. Missing persons reports from across the country were checked and cross-checked, but no matches were found. It was as if these two young people had simply materialized on that South Carolina highway with no past and no connection to anyone or anywhere. The medical examiner's report provided some additional details about the victims. The young man was approximately 5 feet, 11 inches tall, weighing around 150 pounds. He had several distinctive features, including a small scar on his right arm and evidence of dental work that suggested access to good medical care. The young woman was approximately 5 feet, 5 inches tall, with a slender build. She had perfect teeth with no fillings, suggesting she too had received good dental care throughout her life. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case of the Sumter County Does became one of South Carolina's most enduring mysteries. Theories abounded. Were they runaways? Victims of a robbery gone wrong? Were they involved in something criminal themselves? The fact that they carried no identification led some to speculate they might have been in witness protection. or perhaps trying to escape from someone or something. The investigation wasn't helped by the limitations of forensic science in the 1970s. DNA analysis wasn't yet available to law enforcement, and computer databases of missing persons were still years away. Investigators had to rely on more traditional methods: physical descriptions, dental records, and fingerprints. They created clay reconstructions of the victims' faces, hoping someone might recognize them, but these efforts yielded no results. The case took an interesting turn when investigators discovered that the couple had been seen the day before their deaths at a campground in Santee, South Carolina, about 50 miles from where their bodies were found. Witnesses described them as friendly and unremarkable, appearing to be just another young couple traveling through. They had arrived in a white Chevrolet, but no such vehicle was found near their bodies, suggesting either that the killer or killers had taken it, or that this lead was incorrect. The brutality of the crime suggested to investigators that this wasn't a simple robbery. The multiple gunshot wounds, particularly to the young woman, indicated a level of violence that seemed personal rather than opportunistic. Yet if this was a targeted killing, why haven't any family members or friends ever come forward to identify them? Years passed, and the case file grew thick with false leads and dead ends. Every few years, a new detective would dust off the file, hoping fresh eyes might spot something overlooked. The advent of the internet age brought new possibilities. Missing persons websites and online databases made it easier to share information about unidentified remains. Still, the identities of the young couple remained elusive. In the 1990s, DNA samples were finally extracted from the remains, but the technology was still limited, and there were few databases to compare against. The samples were preserved, however, waiting for the day when advances in forensic science might finally provide answers. That day would come, but not for many years. The case continued to haunt the community of Sumter County. Local law enforcement never gave up hope of identifying the victims, and the case became something of a legend among South Carolina law enforcement. The young couple's grave in Sumter Cemetery became a symbol of the case's enduring mystery, marked with a simple headstone reading, "Male and Female Homicide Victims, August 9, 1976. As the decades passed, the case of the Sumter County Does became more than just an unsolved murder. It became a testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the evolution of forensic science. The preservation of evidence and DNA samples would prove crucial when, in the early 2000s, genetic genealogy began to emerge as a powerful new tool in solving cold cases. This new technique, which combines traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research, had already helped solve numerous cold cases across the country. It works by comparing DNA profiles to large databases of genetic information, looking for matches with distant relatives who have submitted their DNA to genealogical websites. By building family trees and following genetic connections, investigators can often identify unknown individuals, even decades after their deaths. The breakthrough in the Sumter County Does case would finally come in 2021, but the path to that revelation would involve years of careful work, new technological advances, and the dedication of a new generation of investigators determined to give names to the young couple who had remained anonymous for so long. The real breakthrough began when investigators partnered with DNA Doe Project, a non-profit organization specializing in using genetic genealogy to identify John and Jane Does. The organization's volunteers began the painstaking process of analyzing the DNA profiles extracted from the victims' remains, comparing them against publicly available genetic databases, and constructing elaborate family trees. The male victim's DNA provided the first breakthrough. Through careful genetic analysis and genealogical research, investigators were able to determine that he was James Paul Freund, born in 1956 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Freund had disappeared in 1976 at the age of 20, but no missing persons report had ever been filed. Further investigation revealed why. His family believed he had simply chosen to leave home and start a new life elsewhere, a not uncommon occurrence during that era. The identification of the female victim followed shortly after. She was Pamela Mae Buckley, born in 1957 in Minnesota. Like Freund, she had never been reported missing. Her family, too, had assumed she had voluntarily struck out on her own, seeking adventure or a fresh start. She was just 18 years old at the time of her death. The identifications, announced in January 2021, brought both closure and new questions. Investigators began the difficult task of reconstructing the victim's final months, trying to understand how a young man from Pennsylvania and a young woman from Minnesota had ended up together on that lonely South Carolina highway. Through interviews with family members and friends, a picture began to emerge. James Freund had been described as a free spirit, someone who wasn't content with the conventional path of college or immediate employment after high school. He had worked various jobs in Lancaster, including at a local car wash, but had expressed desires to travel and see more of the country. Pamela Buckley's story was similar. Growing up in Colorado City, Minnesota, she had been described by family members as independent and adventurous. In the mid-1970s, she had told her family she was leaving to travel, a common enough occurrence during that era of hippie culture and youth mobility. Her family had received occasional communications from her indicating she was okay, but these eventually stopped. The investigation revealed that both Freund and Buckley had likely been part of the counterculture movement of the 1970s, traveling across the country, taking odd jobs, and living what was then called a hippie lifestyle. This helped explain the lack of identification on their persons. Many young people in that movement deliberately carried minimal identification, sometimes as a statement against the system. But this new information only deepened the mystery of their deaths. If they were simply young travelers, what had led to their violent end? The multiple gunshot wounds still suggested a personal motive, but neither Freund nor Buckley appeared to have any enemies or connections to criminal activity. The investigation also revealed new details about their final days. Additional witnesses came forward, having seen the couple at various locations in South Carolina in the days leading up to their deaths. They had been spotted at a diner in Columbia, where witnesses described them as cheerful and affectionate. They seemed to have money to spend and weren't asking for handouts or appearing distressed in any way. The white Chevrolet they had been seen driving remained a crucial piece of the puzzle. Registration records from the period were searched, but no vehicle matching the description was ever found registered to either Freund or Buckley. This led investigators to theorize that they might have been traveling in someone else's vehicle, perhaps borrowed or purchased informally, another common practice among young travelers of that era. The location where their bodies were found took on new significance with their identifications. Highway 521, where they were discovered, was a major route connecting the South Carolina coast to inland areas. In the 1970s, it was frequently used by both tourists and drug traffickers. Some investigators began to wonder if Freund and Buckley had witnessed something they shouldn't have, or perhaps unwittingly become involved with dangerous people. The medical examiner's original reports were reviewed with fresh eyes. The positioning of the bodies and the pattern of gunshot wounds suggested the couple had been shot while standing, then fell where they were found. This indicated they might have been forced to stop their vehicle, perhaps by someone posing as a law enforcement officer or someone with car trouble, a common ruse used by criminals of the era. The brutality of the crime, particularly the 5 shots fired into Pamela Buckley, continued to suggest personal motivation. Yet extensive background checks into both victims revealed no obvious enemies or connections to criminal elements. Their families described them as peaceful, non-confrontational young people who avoided trouble. The jewelry Pamela had been wearing, the distinctive Native American-style pieces, was finally traced to a maker in the southwestern United States, but this lead provided no additional clues about their final days. It did, however, support the theory that the couple had been traveling extensively across the country before their deaths. As investigators dug deeper into James Freund's background, they discovered he had been an amateur photographer. No camera was found with their bodies, but several people who had encountered the couple in their final days remembered seeing Freund with a camera. This raised the possibility that the killer or killers had taken not only their identification, but also any photographs that might have documented their travels, or potentially something they weren't meant to see. The case took another interesting turn when investigators discovered records of a series of similar shootings along southern highways in the mid-1970s. While none exactly matched the pattern of the Sumter County killings, they demonstrated that the highways of that era could be dangerous places, particularly for young travelers who might be perceived as easy targets. The identification of Freund and Buckley also led investigators to explore a series of unsolved murders along the East Coast during the same time period. Between 1974 and 1976, several young couples had been found shot to death near highways in various states. While the methods and circumstances varied, there were enough similarities to warrant investigation into possible connections. Investigators began interviewing surviving family members of both victims, hoping to piece together their movements in the months leading up to their deaths. Pamela's sister recalled receiving a postcard from Florida in early 1976, suggesting the couple had spent time in the Sunshine State. James's brother remembered a phone call where his sibling mentioned working at a carnival, though he couldn't recall which one or where it was located. The carnival connection proved particularly intriguing. The 1970s saw numerous traveling carnivals moving up and down the East Coast, providing temporary employment for young people like Freund and Buckley. These carnivals often operated on a cash basis, explaining the lack of official employment records. Several carnival workers from that era were interviewed, but none could definitively remember the couple. One significant lead emerged when investigators located a former diner waitress who had served the couple breakfast just 2 days before their deaths. She recalled them discussing plans to head to Florida, where they had apparently lined up jobs at a hotel in the Keys. This contradicted their northbound location on Highway 521, suggesting something or someone had caused them to change their plans. The waitress's account also provided another crucial detail. She remembered the couple paying with cash from a thick roll of bills. This detail sparked new theories about their deaths. Had someone observed them with a substantial amount of cash? The fact that no money was found on their bodies supported the possibility of robbery as a motive, though the excessive violence still suggested something more personal. Further investigation into James Freund's background revealed that he had taken several photography courses in high school and was quite skilled with a camera. Family members provided some of his earlier photographs, showing a talented eye for composition. The missing camera became an even more significant detail. Could Freund have photographed something he wasn't supposed to see? The investigation also focused on the removed clothing tags. This detail had puzzled investigators for decades. The professional and methodical removal of all identifying labels suggested the killer or killers had spent considerable time with the bodies, taking care to eliminate any possible leads. This level of forensic awareness was unusual for the time period, leading some investigators to speculate about the involvement of someone with law enforcement or military background. A review of similar cases from the era revealed another interesting pattern. Between 1975 and 1977, there were several reports of a man impersonating a police officer along southern highways, particularly in the Carolinas. While none of these incidents had resulted in murder, they demonstrated that predators were indeed operating in the area, targeting young travelers. The white Chevrolet remained a crucial piece of the puzzle. A deep dive into vehicle registration records from multiple states finally yielded a possible lead. A white 1975 Chevrolet Impala had been reported abandoned in Georgia in late 1976, but by the time authorities responded to the report, the vehicle had disappeared. The timing and location were tantalizing, but without the actual vehicle or its vehicle identification number, investigators couldn't make a definitive connection. Weather records from August 9, 1976 were examined in detail. The night had been clear and warm, with a full moon, conditions that would have made it difficult for a killer to operate without being seen from the highway. This suggested the murders likely occurred in the early morning hours, when traffic would have been minimal. Soil samples taken from the victim's clothing in 1976 had been preserved, and new analysis revealed traces of red clay characteristic of Georgia's soil composition, rather than South Carolina's sandy soil. This suggested the couple had recently been in Georgia, possibly supporting the theory about the abandoned Chevrolet. The investigation also focused on the unique aspects of Highway 521 in 1976. The road was a major trafficking route for illegal goods, particularly moonshine and marijuana. Several former law enforcement officers who had worked the area in the 1970s confirmed that criminal organizations regularly used the highway, often employing lookouts and armed security. Could Freund and Buckley have unknowingly stumbled upon such an operation? The Native American jewelry worn by Pamela Buckley was finally traced to a specific artisan in Arizona. While the artist had passed away years ago, his family still had records of sales from that period. They confirmed that similar pieces had been sold at various music festivals and craft fairs across the country in 1975 and 1976, but the specific pieces weren't unique enough to trace to a particular sale. As investigators continued to dig deeper into the case, they discovered another crucial detail that had been overlooked in the original investigation. A retired gas station attendant from Sumter County came forward after seeing news coverage of the identifications. He remembered the couple stopping for fuel late on August 8, 1976. More importantly, he recalled them being followed by a dark-colored sedan with 2 male occupants. While this information came decades late, it provided the first solid evidence that the couple might have been targeted before their deaths. The gas station attendant's account led investigators to review unsolved crimes involving dark sedans from that period. They discovered a string of gas station robberies along Highway 521 in the summer of 1976, all reportedly committed by 2 men in a dark-colored car. While none of these robberies had turned violent, they demonstrated that criminal elements were active in the area at the time. The investigation took another turn when researchers discovered a series of newspaper articles from 1976 detailing similar incidents along the East Coast. In particular, a report from Virginia described a young couple being forced off the road by men claiming to be police officers. While that couple had managed to escape, their description of the perpetrator's methods, using a dark sedan with a portable blue light, matched aspects of other highway crimes from the period. Another significant development came when investigators located a former carnival worker who recognized Freund from a photograph. The worker, now elderly, recalled working with someone matching Freund's description at a carnival in Georgia in early summer 1976. He remembered Freund as a quiet young man who often took photographs of the carnival operations and seemed particularly interested in documenting life on the road. This carnival connection helped establish a possible timeline for the couple's movements. Starting in Minnesota, where Pamela Buckley had last been seen by her family, they had apparently worked their way south through various temporary jobs. The carnival's route through Georgia aligned with the soil evidence found on their clothing, and its final stops put them in the vicinity of South Carolina in early August. The investigation also revealed new details about the weapons used in the murders. The .357 caliber revolver had left distinctive markings on the recovered bullets, and modern ballistics databases finally yielded a match. The same weapon had been used in an unsolved gas station robbery in North Carolina 2 weeks before the murders. In that incident, no one had been injured, but the robbers had fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The bullet had been preserved in evidence, providing the crucial match. Further analysis of the crime scene photographs using modern photogrammetry techniques revealed previously unnoticed details. Tire tracks preserved in the soft shoulder of the highway suggested that 3 vehicles had been present, presumably the victim's white Chevrolet and 2 other vehicles. This supported the gas station attendant's account of the couple being followed and suggested multiple perpetrators were involved. The position of the shell casings, when analyzed with modern forensic mapping techniques, indicated that the shooters had likely approached from 2 different directions. This pointed to a planned ambush rather than a chance encounter, raising new questions about why Freund and Buckley had been targeted. Interviews with Buckley's surviving family members revealed another crucial detail. In her last communication home, Pamela had mentioned meeting someone who had offered her and James work at a private fishing lodge in Florida. The lodge was never named, but this detail aligned with the waitress's recollection of their planned trip to Florida. Investigators began examining records of fishing lodges operating in Florida in 1976, particularly those that had been linked to drug trafficking or other illegal activities. The investigation also focused on the removal of clothing tags. Modern analysis of the cutting patterns suggested the use of a specialized tool similar to those used by emergency medical personnel or law enforcement. This level of forensic awareness, combined with the methodical nature of the evidence removal, continued to suggest that at least one of the killers had professional training. A review of cold case files from neighboring states revealed another pattern. Throughout 1976, there had been several reports of couples being approached by men claiming to be drug enforcement agents. These incidents, while reported to various local authorities, had never been connected until now. The reports described similar methods: a dark sedan, multiple male suspects, and law enforcement impersonation. The historical context of 1976 provided additional insights. It was America's bicentennial year, and many young people were traveling the country, taking advantage of various celebrations and festivals. This made it easier for Freund and Buckley to move around without attracting attention, but it also made them part of a vulnerable population targeted by predators. As investigators continued to piece together the couple's final movements, a clearer picture emerged of their last day alive. They had been seen at multiple locations along Highway 521, apparently making their way north despite their stated intentions to go to Florida. This suggested they might have been trying to evade someone, perhaps aware they were being followed. The multiple gunshot wounds, particularly those inflicted on Pamela Buckley, took on new significance when analyzed with modern forensic techniques. The pattern suggested that she had been shot first, possibly while trying to run away, while James Freund's wounds indicated he had been facing his killers. This pointed to a level of personal interaction before the shooting, rather than a simple ambush. The case took another interesting turn when investigators discovered records of a federal drug task force operation that had been active in the Carolinas during the summer of 1976. The operation, focused on disrupting marijuana trafficking routes, had employed numerous undercover agents and informants. Some investigators began to wonder if Freund and Buckley had unknowingly photographed or witnessed something related to these operations. The white Chevrolet continued to be a crucial element of the investigation. A review of impound lot records from Georgia and South Carolina revealed several white Chevrolets recovered in late 1976, but most had been scrapped or resold before their significance could be determined. However, One photograph from a Georgia impound lot showed a white Chevrolet with damage consistent with being forced off the road. As investigators delved deeper into the Georgia impound lot records, they discovered that the damaged white Chevrolet had been claimed by someone using false identification. The timing and location aligned perfectly with the Sumter County case, but decades later, tracking down information about who had claimed the vehicle proved impossible. The impound lot had changed ownership multiple times, and most records from that era had been destroyed. The investigation also revealed another crucial detail about James Freund's photography hobby. His family provided additional photographs he had taken before leaving Pennsylvania, showing he had a particular interest in documenting law enforcement activities. Several of his surviving photos showed police cars, traffic stops, and other police activities, all taken from a respectful distance, but demonstrating a clear fascination with law enforcement operations. This interest in police photography took on new significance when considered alongside the theory that the killers may have had law enforcement connections. Could Freund's hobby have inadvertently put him and Buckley in danger? If he had photographed something sensitive, perhaps related to the Federal Drug Task Force operations or illegal activities disguised as law enforcement, it could explain both the targeted nature of the killings and the thorough removal of evidence. Modern analysis of the crime scene area revealed another overlooked detail. The location where the bodies were found was just out of sight of a former fire tower that had been used as an observation post by local law enforcement. In 1976, this tower would have provided a clear view of much of Highway 521, making it an ideal spot for monitoring traffic, both for law enforcement and for those involved in illegal activities. Interviews with retired law enforcement officers who had worked in the area in 1976 revealed that there had been significant tension between local authorities and federal agents during that period. The Federal Drug Task Force operations often conflicted with local investigations, and there were allegations of corruption on both sides. This complicated law enforcement landscape might explain why the initial investigation faced so many obstacles. The medical examiner's original reports were digitized and analyzed using modern forensic software. This analysis revealed subtle details about the shooting sequence that had been previously overlooked. The angle and trajectory of the bullets suggested that at least one of the shooters had been significantly taller than the victims, while another had fired from a lower position, possibly from behind the cover of a vehicle. The investigation also uncovered an interesting connection to a series of pharmacy robberies that had occurred along the East Coast in 1976. These robberies had been particularly sophisticated, with the perpetrators showing knowledge of both pharmacy operations and law enforcement procedures. Several of these robberies had occurred along the same routes that Freund and Buckley had traveled. A breakthrough came when investigators located a former motel owner from Georgia who remembered the couple. They had stayed at his motel in late July 1976, and he specifically recalled Freund taking photographs of a late-night gathering in the motel parking lot. He described seeing several dark sedans and men in suits, but had assumed it was a legitimate law enforcement operation. The motel's location was known to have been a meeting point for both legal and illegal operations during that period. The case of James Freund and Pamela Buckley remains officially unsolved, but their identification after 45 years has provided crucial new leads and a better understanding of the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The evidence increasingly points to their murders being connected to either organized crime, corrupt law enforcement, or both, a complex web of illegal activities operating along the highways of the American South in the mid-1970s. Their story serves as both a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by young travelers during that era and a testament to the power of modern forensic science to bring answers to decades-old questions. While their killers may never be brought to justice, James and Pamela are no longer simply the Sumter County Does. They have their names back, and their families finally know what happened to them on that warm August night in 1976. The investigation continues, with new leads still being developed through advanced forensic techniques and ongoing interviews. Perhaps someday, the full truth about who killed James Freund and Pamela Buckley, and why, will finally come to light. Until then, their case remains one of the most intriguing and complex unsolved murders in South Carolina history, a reminder that even decades-old mysteries can yield new clues when examined with modern investigative techniques and unwavering determination.